Today on the show, I'm delighted to be joined by Ji Hyang Padma, who is the most amazing author and spiritual teacher. So hello there.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. You've written this most beautiful book called Field of Blessings, but I know it's come from your own life where you've been creating positive changes. So please take us back and tell us how your positive changes journey began.
Well, my journey began as an emergency medical technician when I was still in high school. And during that time, it gave me a real window into the suffering that goes on in life and the fact that life is impermanent. And that produced a big question for me, which is, what do we do with that? What I do with that? How could I really be of benefit to people and alleviate their suffering? So that started with EMT training. But then across time, I really became curious to look at the root, to get at the root of the causes and conditions of their suffering. And that brought me to meditation and ultimately to study these traditional Buddhist healing practices.
So you not like spiritual before, you're very clinical with like working like, the emergency services and ambulance, or did you grow up with spirituality around you?
Well, I grew up actually as Catholic, and I feel like the Catholic education really helped me quite a bit, although not the way that they expected it to. I think it was really helpful for providing me with a kind of ethical, moral foundation and a sense that life was not just for my own happiness, but also to be a benefit to others. And certainly that is a through line that continues in my life and my practice. So I think the place where the clinical kind of shifted into the spiritual is that reality of clinical failure. 4 out of 5 times in the field, CPR doesn't work. That we will have been working on someone's body to revive them, and ultimately someone will have to go to the next room to the family and say, I'm sorry, but there isn't anything else we can do. And this year I was working at UCSF, a major medical center in California. And it is absolutely the same. Even with the very best technology and the most gifted clinicians, there's still the reality of human mortality and this necessity in that case of taking a spiritual approach and seeing that even in the situations where there cannot be physical curing, there can be spiritual healing.
So who's the spiritual healing for? Because I'm assuming you're saying that when CPR fails, they die. Where does the spiritual healing come in with that?
Well, the spiritual healing can be in reconciliation and the restoration of relationships before a person passes, or, in the midst of their physical distress. There can be a new unity in the family, a renewal of love. Those are the kind of elements that I would consider a spiritual healing.
So do you still work clinically now? You're still in the hospital doing that as well, but you're a spiritual teacher?
I just finished working in the hospital about a week ago.
Oh, okay.
So actually right now I'm teaching at Omega Institute, which is a beautiful holistic retreat center in the Hudson River Valley of New York State. And so I'm here as the meditation teacher in residence. It's a great way for me to replenish my well so that I can be a benefit to more people.
I love that. I was asking because like my background, I'm sure many of the listeners now know, is that I worked as a chemotherapy nurse. So I worked a lot in clinical. Mm-hmm. But my next book, Good Grief, The AG Approach to Modern Day Grief Healing, sort of shares why I walked away from the clinical, because I'd seen so much of the spiritual and, that when it comes to transition to another existence and always consciousness, and it just didn't resonate with me anymore. I became more that we are more than this physical body. So I was just interested if you're still clinical, but you've also gone into the spiritual side of our health as well.
Yeah, so at UCSF as a chaplain, I was called to the bedside in these cases where people were struggling. it wasn't, there were other people who were helping them on a physical level. But regardless of whatever could be achieved with the physical intervention, people still have a need, always have a need to come into a sense of connection with themselves and with their relationships. And that's the same whether we're working within the framework of Western medicine or we're working in a more holistic setting like Omega Institute. And that's really the focus of my research, which is how do these traditional Buddhist healing practices help us to reconnect with ourselves, with our relationships, and with our world?
And I started to read your book, Field of Blessings, and it is about your research, isn't it? A bit like Good Grief, where we're looking at the ancient ways of using it in modern day healthcare. So for those listening today, what do you mean by Field of Blessings? What does that mean for us?
Field of Blessings refers to, in traditional Buddhist literature, the way in which the presence of an awakened being would actually catalyze healing and awakening in those around. Just as a stone thrown into water will ripple out. In the same way, whatever work we do to awaken, to reconnect with ourselves, that will have an effect upon everyone we come into contact with.
So is that like oneness, that we are all interconnected even though we can't see it?
Well, it's through that connection that the work that we do, the presence that we bring to life, then begins to have a healing impact upon our world. And this has been researched. It's been shown that when one person practices loving kindness, for instance, people 6 removes away become kinder.
I love that. I know about the power of prayer. I remember watching a documentary years ago because I saw my gran, she was like Catholic and she was always praying and things like that. But to actually see the science behind it, that if you pray and believe, the power of belief, when we all come together,
yes,
there is science behind it nowadays. But back in those days, it's sort of just an interesting program, but there is proof that when you think positive, you attract positive. When you pray and believe, then things turn out better. So I love the fact there's so much research going on.
Yeah, it's been an exciting time to be in the field because particularly there have been so many findings in the area of relational neuroscience. We've kind of understood that a healthy connection enhances people's wellness on many levels, but it's just now that we can show exactly how that works neurologically. And so out of that, we begin to understand just scientifically that the mind is more than the brain. The mind is an embodied and relational process. And when we recognize that, that completely changes our paradigms from a paradigm of isolation to a paradigm of connection.
I love that. I have a death cafe here, and the little mantra for it is like participation, not isolation. And it is about me getting people that are grieving from their homes and stepping into a new environment and having those conversations. So I love that. What I also picked up on, you said about healthy connection. And I know that in your research around healing, you talk about attachment theory. So tell us about that.
So attachment theory is something that sometimes people have thought is just referring to either what happens to children or what happens in our romantic relationships, but really it's about all of our relationships. So on a basic level, many of your listeners might be already knowledgeable about core attachment theory. The basic idea is that the relationship we have with our early caregivers actually is the foundation for all of our relationships in later life. Those first couple years of life are really critical. And the patterns of connection that are formed then are really wired into the developing brain. However, at that time, the brain doesn't have the conscious memory online yet. The prefrontal cortex of the brain is not completely developed yet. So all of these really core patterns are imprinting on the limbic system, the amygdala, which is not a conscious memory, it's really an implicit one. And that's why love is such a complex thing, because it's really predicated on the circuitry that is unconscious. Now, if we have a connection with our caregivers that's basically secure, when we need help or reassurance, it's there, then we could say we develop what's called secure attachment. The way that we connect to ourselves and to the people around us is relatively free of encumbrance or fear. We can relate in a way that's easy and natural. However, on the other hand, if one of our caregivers is a bit dismissive, isn't really emotionally available, then we might have a kind of pattern of expecting relationships to be hard work. We might actually stifle some of our own impulse towards connection because we've received in early life this message that that's not a good idea, or that kind of outreaching doesn't work. And so because of that, we will have less capacity for being able to connect with our own body, with our own emotions, and also to be able to read and relate to the emotions and connections of others. On the other hand, if we have a parent that does strive to be available, but is a bit preoccupied with their own life or with their own story, then we might develop what's called anxious attachment, which is where the system is a little bit overly primed. It's overworking, overdoing in relationships. And in that case, the emotional circuitry is chronically overstimulated. We can say that is often a setup for patterns of anxiety or depression. There's lots of limbic information coming through. There's a lot of emotion, but the emotion isn't always exactly balanced. And so then the work is to come into good connection with those places in our own emotions that are a bit chaotic, so that those experiences can be more integrated and we can respond in a way that is connected to our own emotions, but at the same time not overwhelmed by old information that isn't really apropos to present day. So that we're not preoccupied by those early life experiences. And the way that we come into that is through being in good connection with our own body, mind, and finding connections, finding important healing relationships that are trustworthy, through which whatever our early life experience was, we can now bring our relational patterns up to date and develop what is called earned secure attachment.
So if you've had, I don't say a bad upbringing, but if you've had like a childhood where you don't feel that secure, that heard, that visible, you say that you heal by finding better relationships in your adulthood?
Precisely. Yes, whether it's a mentor, a friend, a lover, whoever that might be, whatever that trustworthy relationship is, that's right there. We have the capacity to do the work, to bring our relational pattern up to date and earn that secure attachment that brings us a kind of basic happiness.
So it's quite courageous, because if all you've ever known is sort of relations that make you feel insecure or not heard or invisible, what could people do? There's going to be people out there that have that kind of upbringing or broken relationship. how can they get there? Do you mean, how do they have that leap of faith to learn?
Yeah, that's where it's absolutely important to find that person, whether it's your mentor or therapist, or a good brother or sister in some way. As a spiritual teacher, I hope that I serve that way to my community. And then through that, we experience being mirrored. We experience someone holding space for us, and that then gives us the capacity to hold space for ourselves. And so when I did this research with the Buddhist healers that I spoke to, they said that that's the relationship they try to create with a client. By creating inner space through their meditation, they're then able to create sacred space and therapeutically with a client. And they hope that then serves as the model through which all of the client's relationships can be healing relationships.
That's really interesting. I'm a huge advocate for self-care, self-love, self-healing. I think everything brings, with ourselves, because with ourselves from our first breath to our last. Do you believe in that as well, that we have to start with ourselves?
Oh, precisely, completely. As one meditation teacher said, even if we looked through the entire world, we would find no one more worthy of loving kindness than ourselves. We can't offer anyone anything that we haven't already been able to offer to ourselves. So by creating this sacred space for ourselves and forming a kind of unconditional kindness and acceptance with our own body, mind, that inner space is then the basis through which we're able to enter into good relationship with others.
Yeah, I was just checking, because I know from where listeners have reached out to me after certain episodes, they really struggle like self-worth, which means they don't feel worthy of getting help or worthy of having that new relationship or picking up the phone to a therapist. And so I was just thinking, like, how do they do it? It just seems like it's going to leap straight into therapy. But as you say, it is start with yourself, so you are worthy, you're caring, you know what you like and don't like. So it's a starting point.
That's right. Right. So I think one has to have, enough trust in oneself to make that first move.
Yeah.
Just enough trust in oneself to reach out and find a therapist or a healer, someone who's going to help to hold space and reflect and mirror back. Right. And then that can be the catalyst, for many other healing relationships.
Yeah. What I loved in the book, some of the researchers, I can't remember her whole name, I'm sure you know, but Heidi, someone, and she had quotes like, she'd always heard clients saying, I felt like I was living half of my life before. I felt something was missing, which I know I can relate to at stages in my life. And this is what we're saying here. Like, when you don't have that greatest attachment in the beginning, you can go through life feeling like something's missing. So to me, obviously slightly biased, I'm honest, Ji Hyang, but to me, that sounds like an ideal time to make a positive change. When you know something's missing, it's not enough what you've got. So you talk of this of visions of wholeness. So tell us about that.
Well, visions of wholeness refers to the way in which these healers, are able to hold that vision of wholeness for their client. They're able to see the client in what we would say their Buddha nature, in that core wholeness that each one of us has without exception. And regardless of their neurosis or regardless of their flaws, being able to see and anchor that vision within the client gives then that to the client, that possibility of seeing and anchoring that for themselves.
That's beautiful. Now, you've spoken about meditation being one of the many tools that can help people create positive changes. What other tools have you used?
Well, right now, I think one of the really powerful ways in which the Buddhist practices have been brought into a therapeutic setting is through somatic experiencing. Peter Levine, he works psychologically, but somatically. So working through the body's own knowing, we then have access to a deeper well, because again, these patterns are not anchored in the prefrontal cortex where we have conscious access to them. They're really located in the limbic system. And the limbic system knows things somatically. So working then through the body, one of the techniques that's quite simple that I've shown and shared with people is a kind of self-hug, where we place the left hand up above the right shoulder, the right hand below the left shoulder, and so in those moments when a client is having a moment of anxiety or panic, that's one of the practices that can help to reset the system. Another one that he really encourages is using a kind of hum together with that, and letting that hum come from the lower belly, which is just a basic low sound like that, together with the self-holding, begins to shift us from the place of the anxious response, to a place of greater centeredness. The humming actually helps to activate the vagus nerve system. So when we're in the place of anxiety, what's frequently happening is that those anxious thoughts are creating a kind of negative feedback loop with our limbic system. The mind has an anxious thought, and then it gets amplified by what's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So those glands then send the kind of stress hormones, cortisol and such, ricocheting through the body, which then gives us that experience of butterflies and a racing heart and thinking, oh no, right? So one way to reset that is to consciously send a message through those same pathways that things are basically all right. And so that by making that low humming noise in the gut, we are basically replacing some of that anxious feedback, with a different message. What the humming does is it strengthens that awareness of our centeredness in our gut.
I love that. I know I mentioned in my next book, Good Grief, about, I call it like sound healing. So of course you can sing or you can sort of dance to music. There's that element, but it is about, I think I've got like the bee breath and like the om and things like that. Mm-hmm. And it is like a sound healing.
Yeah.
So yeah. And again, it is an ancient tool, isn't it?
Very much, very much. So in a traditional Buddhist context, the form that would take would be chanting. And so chanting is a traditional way to bring the energy from, the mind where we're sort of overthinking, or the heart where we're just over emoting, back into the gut, which in many, not only Buddhist, but other indigenous systems is considered to be the place of balance, the place of power. So very often people will hear that beautiful multi-note Tibetan chanting, and when we hear that, we can't help but be moved by it. It sounds a little bit like heavy machinery, and yet, right, this, as we hear that, it already has a profoundly grounding effect. So we can create that grounding effect in a quite simple way, just by making those low tones ourselves.
I love that. So is that class as sound healing, or is that subtle energy, or is it both? What is it when you're doing that?
Well, that would be sound healing. It also begins to cross into subtle energy. And another really simple way of working with those energy systems from a Korean Buddhist approach is called Sanyu, which means meditation play. Again, the idea is if we have too much energy in the mind or in the emotions without balance into the tanjin, the lower belly, the hara, then we're going to, we're going to get off balance, put off by life. But we can, at those moments when we're feeling anxious or overwhelmed, we can restore balance simply taking some nice big breaths, breathing in, bring the arms above our head, breathing out, bring them down, and making a big circle.
And that's quite subtle. I know that wasn't a play on words at all, but it is quite subtle, because if you're at work and feeling stressed, you're going to that meeting or you want to pick the kids up from school, you could just pretend you're stretching in the playground. It doesn't look like you're doing some ancient tool, does it?
No, it fits right in. We can find space for this. Even if we're working at a desk, we can take that stretch, and through taking those moments to recenter and reconnect with our body, we're establishing patterns of greater ease, so that when we do experience a little bit of surprise or angst, then our bodies will be able to self-regulate and come into a place of greater ease and balance in and of themselves, because it's become a kind of body habit.
I find it fascinating, because I think, like lots of people, when you wake up, you intuitively, or default mode, whatever it is, just start by stretching your arms up, like, oh, here goes another day. Yeah. Or if you're stuck at your desk, I know I sort of like, if I'm thinking, what am I trying to write? I do naturally put my arms up.
Yeah, it's the same, not only in this Korean Buddhist practice of Sanyu, but also in Taoism, right? The practice of Buddhist Qigong, actually, both in Korea and in China. This is the place where Taoism and Buddhism came into dialogue together. So both in Korea and in China, we have this Buddhist Qigong. In the Chinese Qigong, this movement, bring the arms up and connecting with what we could consider that the energy of the sky or the heavens, that's called, it's part of what's called the Four Golden Wheels.
I've never heard of that, the Four Golden Wheels. I love it.
Yeah, that comes from the work of medical Qigong teacher Robert Peng.
I love that. So in the work that you're doing in the research, I know you call it the Four Golden Wheels, but is that like encouraging the listener to work with the elements which are naturally around us?
Completely, yes.
So could they do that each and every day? Like we're doing this because we're in the UK. So if I woke up this morning, it's pouring of rain.
Yeah.
How could I make that into a positive?
Well, I think doing exercises like this, it helps us mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, have a sense of greater resources and a connection with something that is greater than ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? So it just expands the possibilities.
Yeah. No, I'm smiling as you say that, because as people know, that I worked at end of life as a chemotherapy nurse, and one of the life lessons of the dying was connect to something beyond yourself. And it's always sort of like, whether you do voluntary work in your community, you connect to God, Allah, universe, your soul, and it is that connection, and it is life affirming.
Oh, for sure.
So you shared with us, bless you, meditation, sound, subtle energy, the elements, and that. For people today, if they're thinking, well, I don't know where to start, I'm on Ji Hyang, what would you say is the one positive change they could make today?
I would say begin with ourselves. Begin by holding space for ourselves in a way that is kind and connected to the body. Maybe take a few moments every morning just to listen, just to bring mindful awareness to the breath and mindfulness to the body. And as we do that, then the breath will become deeper. As the breath becomes deeper, the body relaxes. And as the body relaxes, the mind relaxes. So then we're going to directly benefit from that practice and habit of holding our connection to the body with some kindness.
I love what you're saying there. I swear by a morning routine. I just think it sets me up for the day. So I sort of wake up and think, what am I grateful for and why? And it is like I've had shelter from the house overnight, or I've had peace and things like that. And then I do my 10 minutes yoga, then I draw a card for the day ahead. So I love what you're saying. Like when you wake up, listen to your body. It's a beautiful way to start.
Thank you.
So bless you. That's really great. Like you're saying, like start the day like that. But also you have a freebie for the listeners today. So tell them about that on your website.
Yeah, on my website, I have a meditation video. Anyone can access and drop into this direct experience of relaxing and focusing. And that hopefully will be a good place to get started. Thank
you so much. Ji Hyang Padma, I've absolutely loved today. And for those who's listening, the book is called Field of Blessings, out there with John Hunt Publishing. So thank you for joining us today. This week on the show, I am joined by Ji Hyang Padma, who is the most amazing spiritual teacher, who today is going to talk to you about suffering, meditation, Buddhism, clinical, spiritual, loss, parenting, childhood development, relationships, and more. There's so much science, research, and inspiration. So let's go and meet Ji Hyang now.